Welcome back, everyone, to the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. I am your host, as always, Jesse Collings, and joining me here today is a first-time guest for the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. He has emerged really as who I would consider the authority in terms of the space that we're in when it comes to Lucha Libre. Certainly, when it comes to like American analysis of Lucha Libre. It's the Cubs fan. You might know him on social media as at Luchablog. You can find his work pretty much all over the wrestling sphere, but you can certainly check out his blog, which is now at thecubsfan.com. He updates that pretty close to on a daily basis with the latest results and analysis in the world of Lucha Libre, but really happy to have him on my show because there really isn't anyone better to talk about the topic that we're going to discuss today. Cubs fan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no. Thank you for coming onto the show. And what I wanted to do today was to talk about Lucha Libre, which is really not a topic that we get to too often in the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. And that really stems from myself having kind of a casual fan's knowledge of Lucha Libre. And I simply don't have as much to say about the major Lucha promotions as I do about topics like WWE and AEW and New Japan Pro Wrestling. But one of the things that that does not mean that Lucha Libre is not interesting and there's not a lot going on in the major lucha companies and Lucha Libre in the United States and other topics. And there's a lot to cover that we haven't talked about ever on the show. And there's no one better than you, my friend. So I'll start with this question just to start. We know that the pandemic impacted wrestling differently depending on what type of wrestling we're talking about. Wrestling, AEW and WWE, the pandemic meant one thing. For Japanese promotions, the pandemic meant another thing. The impacts are still being felt strongly in Japan in a way that they're not really being felt in the United States. Indie wrestling in the United States was obviously impacted it in a different way. And certainly in Mexico, it was different as well. Can you kind of I guess this is a big ask for the first question, but could you like briefly summarize kind of the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic had on Lucha Libre, particularly with the two major promotions, AAA and CMLL?
It was pretty devastating. Compared to the US and Japan, Mexico has a much higher percentage of their revenue for Lucha Libre coming from live events, from ticket sales. They get minimal money from TV and media deals. They have almost no digital revenue, and there have been attempts to do merchandise online, but they really have not really developed in the way that they've gone for a New Japan shop or WWE or AEW. It's a business that was successful just bringing people into the building and selling stuff to them there, and it was a hard adjustment for them to deal with not having those people there. You could tell that both companies had struggle just continuing on. AAA famously, well, it was not talked about a lot, but they kind of laid off many of their office staff during that time just because they couldn't afford to have office staff. Um, they both promotions adapted by trying to work with the government to put on more televised events or more like things that people could attend safely or that they could still enjoy Lucha Libre. That's when CMLL got into running pay-per-views, internet pay-per-views online. And AAA experimented with like drive-in shows for a while, but it really, I think if anything, it convinced those companies that they need to work harder at finding other revenue sources, because when those ticket sales disappear again, if something like that happens or just a downturn of business, they know now that they need to find other ways to make money.
And my understanding is, particularly with CMLL, particularly with like the Friday night shows and things like that, those were reliant on tourists coming into the city, and there's like deals with hotels and resorts that CML has to shuttle fans to Arena Mexico as this kind of tourist attraction. And obviously during the pandemic, there was a lot less tourists coming into Mexico City, which probably hurts them in that regard as well. Correct?
Yeah. there's actual tour companies that are just built around, we take people to go out drinking on Friday night, and then we take them to Arena Mexico, and then we get them home safely. And they are charging for those tickets a lot more than CMLL is making for those tickets. So there there are multiple people just making a living off doing the tourist stuff, along with the hotel stuff, along with the government having sanctioned tour bus that take people just directly from a shopping mall with a luchador on the bus answering questions, and then they go to the show and they come home from the show for all the weekly CMLL events. Not having those and not having those fans come in for a while, because even when the restrictions started being lifted, it was just people were reluctant to travel for quite a while. Hurt made it a slower recovery for them. I think they've maybe by mid 2022 they started getting those fans back, and you can see that the attendances have picked up considerably. The estimate that CMLL gives itself is like they have 30% of their fan base on a average Friday night is a tourist fan, either someone coming from outside the country or from other parts of Mexico, just trying to go to a Lucha Libre show while they're in Mexico City. And so if you lose the 30% of your attendance every week, that's going to hurt a lot.
Yeah, I was talking to my aunt, and she was telling me that her mother-in-law, who's like 89 years old and went to Mexico, she said that she went to a Lucha Libre show. And I was like, oh, what Lucha, was it AAA? Was it CMLL? And obviously she doesn't know that, but she said she really enjoyed herself. And this is not a typical wrestling fan. And that's kind of the charm of Lucha Libre to an extent, at the surface level, is that it is something that does appeal to people who are not wrestling fans. Certainly if they're coming to Mexico and want to experience authentic Mexican culture, at least to American tourists, Lucha Libre is seen as a major aspect of that.
Yeah, definitely. I think it was, I'm trying to remember the right year, 2016 maybe. Mexico City itself get announced that CML and Lucha Libre itself was official cultural representation of Mexico City that they wanted to promote with it. Like for CML's part, is they got a plaque and they were very happy about that. But from that point on, I think that the government and other tourist groups saw that recognition and started pushing people more and more to go to Arena Mexico or to set up plans for them. And then the style that they run is something that especially compared to AAA, its main competition, the Arena Mexico wrestling is very simple to follow. If you don't even know anything about wrestling, if you've never seen a wrestling show, it's like very clear good guys, very clear bad guys. And the action, there's no lots of interference. There's no names you even need to know, even though they're trying to make that clear. It's the most basic form of wrestling, and it makes it easier for someone who's just unaccustomed to wrestling to get into it and enjoy it.
Yes, it is famously Dave Meltzer's favorite type of wrestling, is the paint by numbers approach to CMLL, where it's very clear and obvious of what's going on. And we talked about the pandemic. So shortly before the pandemic in 2019, Paco Alonso, who is the owner of CMLL and the head decision maker and had been for what, like 35 years, he dies. And my understanding is that the kind of decision making and ownership of CMLL becomes a total mess. His daughter is briefly tries to take over the role, but she kind of ends up being muscled out of the company. And then the pandemic hits, and there's just all sorts of, the company's kind of in disarray post Paco Alonso death and then you have the pandemic coming on top of that. But my understanding is that over the last year that business is really up, that CML is doing quite well. The company is back kind of on stable ground. Can you kind of describe the kind of, post Paco Alonso death, kind of what's happened with CMLL and kind of how they've found their way back this year?
Well, the ownership is kind of confusing, a little bit complicated. It's the Arena Mexico CMLL, or EMLL as it was known then, was founded by Salvador Lutheroff, in the 1930s. He runs the promotion himself, but he also makes so much money from running the promotion that he gets into real estate and makes tremendously amount more money there, where that's the Lutheros family's main revenue, and that's why they're super wealthy because of it. He puts Paco Alonso, which I think is his nephew, and his son Salvador Lutheroff II in charge of the wrestling and boxing that they run at Arena Mexico. The Salvador II takes the boxing, but it does not do well, and he goes on to do other things. And Paco Alonso is left alone to run the company himself for about 35 years. When he passes away, before he passes away, he's clearly grooming his daughter Sophia to take over. But it appears as time has gone by that there were other Lutheran family members who all thought they were going to put their children or put themselves in that position. And the person who's running it now is Salvador Lutheroff III, who is the grandson of the original owner. The second generation Salvador was around briefly just to kind of endorse that we're carrying on with the family. And there was even an interview with I forget who did the interview with the third Salvador Lutheroff, who's already planning on his own son taking over someday. So it's a big family, it's a complicated relationship, and I'm sure somewhere there's a will or there's a agreement about what was supposed to happen that got changed somewhere along the lines. But that really concerned people who were following CMLL because it had been Paco Alonso for so long and it had been stable ownership, and then it changed to multiple people getting involved and who knows who's doing what. But since the end of the pandemic, what the unexpected thing is that they've had a lot of new ideas for a promotion that pretty much does the same thing all the time. And they've made some moves that have really helped things. Some of it's just luck. Losing Rush, losing Dragon Lee, losing the New Wave Generation Dinamitas, all those big names seem like a big hurtful deal when they happened, but they opened up space for new people to get into more top positions. And they moved some people who felt like a big deal out of the promotion, and because they were a big deal. Rush is still a big deal, but he kind of come stale doing the same stuff. So they got new people in those spots. They got they started focusing on a fewer amount of people on the bigger Friday night shows. It was a promotion that famously cycled people in and out of the bigger shows and tried to be more egalitarian about give everyone a chance to work on the shows with big attendance. And they've gone to a more conventional approach of like, let's just try and make the best show possible. And that means some of the lesser workers or some of the people that are not that the booking department is not as fond of are now less likely to be on those big shows, and they group the better people together more often. Sounds simple, but it has made a big difference. And then on a more minor level, or a more specific level, I mean, the second generation Mystico left the company to become Dralistico and team with his brothers. And it was the best thing that could have happened to the promotion, because putting the first generation Mystico back in that role, really, it was something the fans had been asking for a long time. And you can see that the business started to really pick up with people who wanted to see him as Mystico, people who had grown up as seeing him as when he was the megastar in the mid 2000s, now coming back to Arena Mexico with their kids to see him again in that role. So it wasn't like one individual event that did it, but it was a lot of freshening up the product and putting people in better positions than they were before.
Yeah, I found, CMLL's growth this year very interesting because it seemed like they were such a mess like a year ago when you go over some of the stuff that happened. Like they lose Dragon Lee, who I believe, if I recall correctly, he was lost because he worked a PWG event that also had AAA talent on it, which is a big no-no in CMLL. And by him losing, by him doing that, and they fired him, that ultimately kind of played a role in them losing Rush, who's arguably their biggest star. So he leaves. And then you mentioned, is it I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher their names. The Dinamitas, is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. They leave as well. So you lose, not only do you lose arguably your bigger star in Roosh, but you also lose some younger talents that you were hoping to elevate. But kind of like what you described there is it opened up space on the card for younger guys to step in. So like as an American wrestling parallel, you can say like, when the WWF lost Razor Ramon and Diesel, it opened up space for people like Steve Austin and The Rock to step in. And the other aspect of that is the really fascinating career of the original Mystico, who, in the mid 2000s, like you said, is a gigantic star, really one of the biggest stars in wrestling history, and certainly one of the biggest stars in wrestling since the end of the Attitude Era or the start of the 2000s. And he goes to WWE, he's in Cara, everyone knows how that kind of works out for him. Then he spends years kind of bouncing around Mexico, working different gimmicks because he can't be the original Mystico anymore. And then the replacement Mystico leaves to go be Dralistico, who people watching AEW and Ring of Honor have seen several times. But the original Mystico's back under the original gimmick, and he's kind of picks up where he left off, which is as the biggest star in Mexico. And we'll talk about, like, when we talk about like wrestler of the year and those kind of awards, I mean, he has to be in the conversation this year because his success as a top star again in CMLL has been huge and has helped that company get back on stable footing.
Yeah, he's been a huge part of it. It's not like they are even investing these huge storylines to get him over. He's just done the very basic. He's the ace. He's the guy that everyone believes is the number one guy, and then every so often someone like steps up to him or cheats him to win a match, and he comes back the next week and wins it in the center of the ring. It's not a complicated story, but it's the superhero who beats all his enemies story that has worked in Mexico going back to the days of El Santo. And Mexico's just doing the more modern version of it. And he's doing it he's obviously excited about being back in this role, both having the gimmick and being the top star. That's improved his performances, I believe. But the fans have embraced it really totally as well.
What is it about him that it makes him kind of such a big star? Because I never really got it with him. I watch him and I can, like, when I watch Roosh, like, I get why Roosh is a big star in Mexico. I can see his charisma and his work and things like that. I've never really been able to put my finger on why, Mystico is such a big star in Mexico. Why do you think he has gotten so over, and why he is like this star kind of without any kind of peer when he's at his best, whether it's back in the 2000s or like now?
I think originally it was because he was the young flying guy who was pulling off wins that people were surprised by in a similar fashion to Rey Mysterio at the point of his career. But I think now it's more that like he's the the perfect hero, the guy who's just like there's no shades of gray to him. He's like completely a good guy. He's completely confident. He's completely willing to be like silly is not the right word for it, but sometimes like the best professional wrestlers are willing to go way over the top to get a reaction. And Mystico's the guy who runs completely around the ring to slap hands and raise and get everyone cheering. I guess like in a Tanahashi way is the best comparison I could think of. But he's a guy that he's always confident. He always comes through for them. So I mean, there are more edgy guys. There are more like guys who um, have more ups and downs. But because he's like the guy that they can rely on to come through in big moments, I think that's the appeal.
And he's historically been presented as a big deal, which, as we know in wrestling, always helps that fans view someone as a legitimate top star. Maybe it's nostalgia, maybe it's remembering glory days from the past, but that's a very powerful thing to have over fans in wrestling, and he certainly has that. And especially there has to be like a craving because he spent so much time not in that role, with his voyage to WWE and kind of his post WWE career before he was able to finally get back to Mystique being the original Mystico gimmick again.
Yeah, there was a definite craving by him. There's still every interview he does, he talks about it, or seemingly every interview he talks about how he's great. He's so happy to be back. He's so happy to be a top guy again. And all he really wants to do is main event the next big show. He's just always coming up with ideas to go even further, go to the top. I guess in the same way that New Japan wrestlers might talk about, like, this is my path to get to the Tokyo Dome main event. Mystico's always striving to like be in the bigger match. Like he won they run a Mexico versus the World Grand Prix every year for both the men and the women, and he won the men's one this past week. And he was very ecstatic about getting the big win, and also very interested in trying to see how farther he could push it. That like maybe we could take, because Rocky Romero attacked him after the match, so he was like, he was trying to pitch. He was clearly trying to get to the next big match with Rocky. And there's always a next goal that he's pushing to. I think that also helps him.
You mentioned that, the departure of people like Roosh and Dragon Lee kind of opened up opportunities for new names to kind of step into those spots. What are some of those new names on CMLL that have really seen their career take off in the last year or so?
Atlantis Jr. is the obvious one. He's the son of the longtime CMLL star Atlantis. It seemed like a guy that the promotion was higher on than he was ready for at first, but they pushed him as a big star to begin with, and eventually he won the more skeptical parts of their fan base over by the time that he won Stuka Jr.'s match at the anniversary show last year. There are guys who had been around for a while who just like were at the just underneath the main event level, but got more of an opportunity because there weren't the people above them disappeared, like Angel de Oro and Diablo Roja, who are the current tag team champions and had a great year last year just defending those titles. And then more recently, the new Masquerada, the second version of him, who was previously wrestling as Panterita Del Ring Jr., they've given him something similar to what Mystico got originally as a push, as the young guy who does amazing flying tricks, who is pulling off wins that no one expected to win, and he's suddenly a top guy out of nowhere.
Yeah, I definitely have been following Atlantis Jr. a little bit closely. And you're like, I was kind of intrigued in like kind of the meta narrative of him being kind of the second generation, pushed a little bit too fast. Fans kind of having a natural apprehension to him, and then him kind of winning them over. I really enjoyed the Atlantis Jr. Stuka Jr. Match from last year, if only because I found the contrast very interesting between Atlantis Jr. as like the groomed babyface, next top guy person, and Stuka Jr. is kind of like, my understanding is kind of like, a veteran guy that never really got pushed as a main eventer before, who's kind of working with a heel. I thought that was as a casual fan dropping in, I thought that was a really excellent program. And it's kind of interesting to see Atlantis Jr., like you said, win over the skeptical, more hardcore fans that were kind of resistant to him at first.
Yeah, it's especially hard to do that as a young wrestler in Arena Mexico, because there's a history of the fan base, especially the fans that support the more real wrestlers, that they want to see, like in their head, they want to see the guy work his way from the first match to the second match, to the third match, to the fourth match over time. And there are guys who've done that and gone on to be big stars like Volador Jr. But obviously, there's a reason promotion might want to push a guy all the way at the top of the same at the beginning, and it that triggers like feelings that these guys, that especially when it's a second generation wrestler and especially a famous second generation wrestlers, that there's the fan base worries that like they're just making this guy a star, but he hasn't really proven anything. He doesn't really have the abilities. And that feud with Stuka Jr., especially the anniversary match, did a great job of like showcasing how much Atlantis had those abilities, how much he was willing to risk, even if it meant landing on the barricade, doing a dive. So I think that was a very well done program. And I think Stuka Jr., like as a guy who was a career solid mid card guy who was probably never going to be better than that, has really transitioned well to being a Rudo from in that feud and in the year since.
Since he's lost his mask.
Yes.
The and that's what I find kind of interesting about CMLL is, like you said, they're really interesting in the sense that their model is so basic and the creative model is so basic that even implementing minor changes seem to have made a really big difference in their business. And there's something kind of refreshing about that simplicity, where we often discuss booking and kind of wrestling creative as like as this rocket science that you could never quite get your hands on. And yet CMLL, with only a few kind of basic changes, is able to really change their business. And I don't know if that's feasible for any other wrestling company on earth. It seems like every other wrestling company kind of has a like a greater demand for a creative output, but because CMLL has kind of established itself as one thing, that making some minor differences really can make a big difference on business. I guess the closest you could say is that maybe WWE is in somewhat similar stance, where WWE has really made some moderate changes in the last year and has obviously really helped their business as well. And they're really the two kind of
Yeah,
ancient institutions in wrestling.
yeah. It because CML keeps it so basic, I think it does make those like slight changes feel like they're bigger deals. Like one of the stars for the last 12 months in the promotion has been Rocky Romero coming in from New Japan. He had been in the promotion when he was a rookie 20 years ago, and they were able to bring some angles off that. But one of the angles they did was just like the same birthday cake spot that you see on US TV all the time, but because no one does that, and that's like three steps up beyond what anyone would do in a normal CML show, that just shoving a cupcake in Boulder's face came off as a big deal. So when you have set expectations at the same level for so long, even varying just slightly makes a huge deal. It's just setting those expectations in the first place sometimes is the problem.
And I think that's a really important idea in just wrestling booking in general is the wrestling promotions are the ones who set expectations for themselves by delivering any type of consistency in their product, whether that's consistently good or whether it's consistently bad. And that often is kind of what you're working against if you are a booker or a creative mind in a company, is what are fans expecting, and can we deliver on those expectations, and can we exceed those expectations? And it doesn't really matter if it's inherently good or inherently bad. It's more about how can you operate against the expectations that have already been set. And it's really interesting to just kind of look across the board and see a company like CMLL that really understands what kind of product they're presenting, versus other companies that maybe don't understand what product they're presenting nearly as well. And we're going to talk about one of those companies in a second.
Yeah, I think CMLL knows what's trying to do, and it's trying to do the best version of its promotion. I think one big difference between pre-pandemic and post-pandemic is that they're making a better effort of 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 doing the best version of the promotion, and changing a few things to make it better. Where like in the late 2010s, it was more they were just doing what they always do, and they weren't putting as much effort into it. And I think maybe that is another fact that you can look at the pandemic, is that they realized that they were playing with a pat hand too long, and attendance was slowly trickling down, and it got them to realize that if we're going to bring people back, we want to make sure that we have something that they're going to stick around for. But being consistent in that way, and like knowing who they are, and knowing what kind of wrestling they're trying to do, that they're trying to do something that appeals to the fan that does not watch wrestling all the time as much as it appeals to the fan who may have followed Rocky Romero and Boulders for 20 years to get back to them facing off again. Is that's their strength, is that they know what kind of promotion they want to be.
I want to pivot to AAA for a minute here. AAA, of course, is the other big, major lucha promotion in Mexico. Cubs fan, how would you describe AAA's past year?
It's mixed. If you ask AAA believes that they're killing it. They did 3 Triple Manias that did over like 12,000 attendance, higher than that if we believe the numbers they give us. They also did what is that called? They did a World Cup that also drew a big house early in this year. And they feel like they're doing the kind of matches that their fan base likes. If you read anyone who watches the show, not just in English, but even like for the most recent Triple Mania, there was a lot of similar feeling in Spanish that the matches that they're providing aren't really good, that the shows are becoming more of a chore to watch because of production choices they're making, and that they are slipping further. They are not giving the product that the people want to see. That the shrink is more that they have these established brands like the name Triple Mania, but that have gone downhill a fair bit in like the last 12 months.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the production choices, I feel like when I talk to people or see people talking about AAA, especially in the United States, the production comes up a lot, whether it's the commentary, whether it's the camera work. I know like a big thing now is that the commentary plays like through in the arenas as fans are sitting there, like fans can hear the commentary. That's right?
That's right. It's something they started to do on their empty arena tapings during the pandemic, and no one thought of it as any strange then because there's no fans, so you might as well hear the announcers. But then they just did not stop doing it once the fans came. The most recent explanation for the reasoning is that they feel they have a lot of casual fans who do not know the storylines or do not understand what's going on, so that they need to do the commentary over the audio system to make sure that those fans feel part of the programming, and it's not for the knowledgeable fans. But I don't really know if I buy that reasoning, seeing many other promotions have casual fans who don't know what's going on, but they like the wrestlers themselves are there to kind of explain why you should be caring about all of this.
Yeah, I mean, don't give Vince McMahon and Kevin Dunn any ideas because I could see them putting Michael Cole's voice over the PA system to explain absolutely everything that's going on. I guess you only have to look, at CMLL, which, like you said, is what, like 30% of their fan base is tourists coming into the city who maybe have never seen a wrestling show in their life, yet they're able to interact and understand what's going on because the product is presented like that. And if your idea is our product is so complicated or convoluted that we need to have an announcer explaining everything to people all the time, that seems like a booking issue and not necessarily an information issue from the commentary perspective.
Yeah, that's where my mindset is on both the things. That I don't think that I think AAA just likes to try things also that like no one else tries, just to see if they will work for them, but they are slow to give up on ideas when they're obviously not working. And it was clear from a lot of the reactions I saw from people who attended the most recent Triple Mania in Mexico City, that listening to that commentary for 4 hours, it's bad for us watching the stream because the audio mixing makes it so that we can hear the announcers and not the crowd making the reactions. But even if you're in the crowd, just hearing those guys be at a Gus Johnson level 10 for 4 hours, it just wears on you and makes you less excited for the show as it goes on.
Yeah, I can imagine that it's a novel maybe for a minute and then for 4 hours, and especially if you're a returning customer, uh, it's like you said, in AAA's whole existence in some ways is based off of the contrast to CMLL. Would you say that's fair to say that is the case?
Yeah, AAA's origin story is that Televisa wanted to do more modern wrestling, and then CMLL would not give it to them. So they went down the organizational chart until they found Antonio Pena, who's willing to give them the more modern style. And the early AAA, the stuff they add definitely is stuff that CMLL, there's parts of that they've definitely adapted over the years. But as they've experimented more, sometimes they haven't hit as well.
And the AAA product is typically much more violent, like you said, more experimental. You see like more like kind of American style booking practices rather than traditional lucha libre. And it's interesting idea in the sense of, especially if you're an American fan watching lucha libre, seeing AAA kind of to me, it sometimes often comes across like a bad American promotion as opposed to a lucha promotion. And the appeal of it is diminishing because of that, because I don't need another bad American wrestling promotion. I would like, if I'm going to be watching Lucha Libre, I want to see Lucha Libre.
Yeah, the thing about that is that if you have a conversation with Konnan about that, who is the lead booker for that promotion for AAA, he believes he's doing Mexican wrestling, that this is the Mexican wrestling that the Mexican wrestling fans want to see, that they want to see, that he's been booking long enough that he knows that the fans will react to run-ins, they'll react to the referee heel spots, they'll react to the different weapons. But I think if you talk to the people who run CMLL, they would say, no, we're doing Mexican wrestling, and they're not. And it's I think really what the fans will accept, both in Mexico and America, depends on, it can vary a lot from people to people, and like you can offer them very different things, and you can find fans who will want to see it. I think the issue with AAA is that they have this, like, Konnan is a person who keeps up with modern wrestling. You can listen to this podcast if you want to hear him keep up with modern wrestling, but also he relies on tropes and things that work from the mid 90s. He's very still ECW influence in what he provides. He's very Vince Russo WCW era, feels like a lot in his product. And while some of those things absolutely worked in their time, it's there's like a dated feeling to the programming because he's over reliant on some of those things that used to work and do not work as well now. But the other issue, and this is an issue for Mexico, is that there's not a lot of proven booking talent because we've only had two major promotions, and CMLL runs a promotion that like no one else runs, and they haven't had much turnover. And AAA has had Konnan and has Antonio Pena and has had a few other people helping along the lines, but there's not like another option you could go out there and find. There's not a there's not a group of former AAA writers, like there's a group of former WWE writers who seem for a while to get called whenever the new promotion wanted to start. There just isn't a diversity of opinions or options to give people different ways to book promotions.
Yeah, and it's a very difficult aspect of the industry. And me and Garrett Kidney talked about a lot of this when we were talking about TNA, and how TNA, when it was always looking for someone to run creative, they were digging up someone from the past, or someone that, like Dusty Rhodes or Vince Russo, and these people, and Bruce Pritchard, and these people that had ideas, but they were mostly outdated ideas. But where are you going to find, it's hard to find someone who has a track record that's going to impress an executive, that isn't relying on stuff from the past. And what it led to is kind of like a lack of creative development in American wrestling, and I'm sure Mexican wrestling is no different. Like Tony Khan is the first like new creative mind to really pop into American wrestling in quite some time, and he was only able to do that because he's personally, has enormous personal wealth. If you're AAA, it's like, all right, we need new ideas. Where are you getting them from? I guess you could look at people on your roster and see who wrestlers are people that want to take a role in creative. But you're right, and it's interesting. Like Konnan has this like kind of pseudo modern approach to booking, where he might be more modern than CMLL in the sense that CMLL is presenting a classic product that dates back, to the 1930s. But he, in his own way, he is like just as dated by presenting stuff that would have worked 30 years ago in the 1990s. We are now far past that, and there's generations of fans that don't remember Konnan, the giant star of AAA in the 90s, and certainly don't remember like WCW and ECW. And how are you going to reach those fans when your product has aged badly?
Yeah, the one time that AAA tried to go outside of that traditional Konnan Antonio Pena viewpoint was there was a year where Konnan was out of the promotion for reasons, and so they gave the responsibility to Vampiro, and before long, Vampiro actually had the Lucha Underground head writer, Krista Joseph, if you remember that name, as ghostwriting the promotion. And that showed the difficulty of bring someone else in, because while Lucha Underground at times was very critically successful, it was never ring successful really, but it was something that did do a good job of building stars like Pentagon and Phoenix and other names on that show. Booking for in a Mexican promotion in a Lucha Libre style is different from what D. Joseph had done with Lucha Underground itself, and different from his experience when he was a WWE writer. I think ultimately Vampiro and D. Joseph lost the job because Vampiro was bad at the personnel management, which is also a huge part of being a booker, more than even the creative was not good, but the personnel management was probably far worse. But it's even if you look for an outsider, like Tony Khan is an outsider because he knows he's an outsider in multiple ways because he has the money to put himself in that position. But if you found someone you thought had a Tony Khan level of wrestling intellect that you wanted to suddenly put into a AAA position, most of the people who would be that sort of qualified don't have the history and knowledge of what works in Mexico to match with what their wrestling knowledge is. It's a small subset of people who would even fit in that role. And then they would also have to deal with the different ways that AAA works compared to any other promotion. So it's a very tough job to fill. And I understand why, even when Konnan's ideas feel dated and just do not seem to work as well, that they're reluctant to move on from him because their experience of moving on to him hasn't been good, and there's just not. It's a very specific position to fill.
Like as a fan, like, do you enjoy Konnan's product?
No, apparently I've not listened to Konnan's podcast. Apparently he had feelings about my feelings about the product that he made very clear for about 5 minutes. I had to look forward to that. But like I enjoy, we agree because he's a person who understands that there has to be at least one traditional, maybe not good match, but like high flying fireworks show. And he either built that around Vikingo or he built around Commander or someone like that. But the rest of the promotion, it feels like there's an over reliance on U.S. heels coming in to insult all the Mexicans because that was something that he did himself in the 90s as part of Los Gringos Locos. There's the women's wrestling is pretty much a sideshow. There's an over reliance on bringing in outside names to pop to try to get outside fans to care, but that the regular roster just has a similar situation to what WWE was going through many years, where at WrestleMania, the guys who had worked all year would be shoved into matches of lesser importance, while the Rock or whoever else was coming in got the top spots. And you kind of, as a person, if you're just jumping in for the WrestleMania, cool, I get to see the Rock versus John Cena. That's all you really care about. But if you're a person who follows the promotion 365 days, you're upset that the Octagon Junior Villano 3 feud that you've been watching all year just gets pushed into a battle royal because they don't really have a spot for it on the big show. And I think that's some of my issues or pain points with the current promotion. But it's also a situation where I don't think Konnan really cares what people like you or me think of the promotion, because he feels like that in the building, he hears the good reactions, and that's really all that matters for him right now. Those are fans that he's really cares about appealing to.
Is he hearing the good reactions, or is he hearing Hugo Zavenovich's voice?
That's a good question. I know he famously said after the last Triple Mania Tijuana show that he talked to 25 different people, and all 25 of them after the show told him that it was a great show. So he's doing some hardcore polling that Gallup would approve of.
Yes, breathlessly reported in the Wrestling Observer newsletter. I don't know how Dave got that scoop, but he did. You mentioned Vampiro. You mentioned he lost the job because he didn't handle the personnel correctly, and that's obviously a huge part of the job. And that's kind of one of the fascinating aspects of wrestling in Mexico to me, is that it is, in a lot of ways, like stepping back in time. And it's like the territory days, guys walking out of contracts, guys refusing to do jobs. It seems very different than in what we've come to expect in like major American wrestling. And part of that is it has to come down to the economics of the business and how it's different there than it is in the US. And it seems to me like there is a issue in the sense of guys realizing they can make more money in the US in certain cases. And do you see that as kind of like an existential threat to Lucha Libre in Mexico? Or do you think that as a healthy evolution of the business that some guys can leave and create spots for new people?
It's definitely an evolutionary threat because obviously AAA would be seeing like Phoenix and Penta and Rush and other people who are now in AEW more often than their promotion, and they clearly feel like it's like AEW is a partner, but also an issue for them in the same way I guess New Japan might feel the same way, where they're losing some of their top stars every year because they cannot afford to bid with AEW on those names. There's some ways that both of those companies I think probably could handle their own business better. I know that many of the AAA stars, many people associate with AAA or see on TV all the time are not actually under contracts. There's a lot of Mexican wrestling is like the territory days, where there's a lot of handshake deals or verbal commitments that will give you 4 more dates and or we'll see you on this date that that allow those both AAA and CMLL to have a lot of flexibility in what they're doing and not be owed as much money in case shows don't happen, but also leave them very vulnerable to people not people changing your mind and nothing holding them back. It came up with this past Triple Mania sequence where Rush made it public that he was going to show up for one of the matches, and quietly it was revealed that Rush really had no guarantee that it was going or no necessarily had to show up because he would never signed a contract with the promotion. The promotion never AAA never thought, oh, we have to lock this guy down because we're having a main event for 2 of our next 3 shows. But the US is always going to be a bigger issue unless the Mexican promotions grow greatly in size or that they find a way to tap money in the US, be media deals or touring or whatever. They're always going to be at risk that their top stars are going to just disappear at any point to WWE or AEW. They just they don't have the revenue to compete, and so pushing the young stars, pushing a Vikingo or Commander or a Masker Dorada or I'm trying to think of another name here. I'm blanking, but all those guys, the push. But as soon as you push them as top stars, there's like a invisible countdown clock that's coming until someone in AEW or WWE decides catches on to Mexico, which takes longer than Japan, but eventually they make a buzz for themselves. Maybe they have to go to Japan, maybe they have to go to the US. But eventually there's a clock's going ticking down until they make their offer that the promotions themselves cannot compete with. And you have to, if the promotion is on the ball, which arguably if they ever are, but if they're on the ball, they know that they have to get the most out of this wrestler, this young promising wrestler right now, because they know 2 or 3 years ago from now, they might not have access to that wrestler. And I don't know that's a problem that's going to be easily fixed unless suddenly like AAA lose out their dreams and becomes a big name in the US touring. They're just not going to be able to compete with those groups.
Yeah, it's a very interesting dynamic in the sense that who I do think the Mystico experiment is really interesting in the sense of Mystico was this gigantic star in Mexico. And he got signed to WWE and his career really just pancakes and falls flat on his face. And it kind of is interesting in that it gives off the impression that it doesn't necessarily matter how big of a star you are in Mexico, you might have to start from ground zero in the US. It's a little different AEW because AEW at least acknowledges Mexican wrestling in a way WWE really doesn't. And the AEW fan base, some of them will know the Mexican wrestler coming in, like a wrestler like Vikingo, for example. But I wonder how much how times have changed in that sense of like Mexican wrestlers in the major American promotions and kind of how that looks, because I think they have two different approaches, and I kind of wanted to touch on that. And I'll start with the sense of I'll ask you this, like, who do you think does a better job promoting like lucha talents, WWE or AEW?
It's tough. I think at different points in the recent past, I would have said either one. I think obviously with the success the LWO group has had and the popularity they've had in WWE, it feels like they're the stronger group. But then when you look down at it, it is ended up being something to get Rey Mysterio over. It's not like they're developing. They have Santos Escobar as part of the group, but they haven't pulled the trigger on making him actually the star of the group. And you can see they've had Anel Garza and Humberto Carrillo up on the main roster, and they have not done particularly well. It looks like they're getting another shot in NXT right now. Dragon Lee just started, and they seem to be doing okay with him. But like a similar star to Dragon Lee, if he came from the U.S. Indies or from Japan, I don't know if they would be like starting him off at the low level of NXT competing for the secondary title, or if they would have had him as a bigger star in that, or if they would have had him challenging for a top title, or even like being on the main roster quickly. But um, with AEW, they do focus on the Mexican wrestlers more, and it's obvious that Tony Khan, um, I know this firsthand, really likes the Lucha Libre talent. He's really a fan of what they do, and believes that them doing their style can create exciting matches for TV. But the flip side is that he puts them on to have exciting matches, but they're usually the B side of whatever match. And Commander does some basic stuff, and then he loses to another match. I think he's won maybe one match and lost 9 on TV or something like that. Bandito, same way, where Bandito didn't seem like he got many big wins his before his injury. And like Lucha Brothers have done well at times, and other times have just kind of faded back into the mix. I think there's I think WB is more like stuck on the notion that they really have to make a Hispanic star, so they're going to keep trying these guys with the idea that they might make them the star, but then they will eventually back off at some point when they decide that they don't speak English enough to make it work. So it's going to be a more inconsistent promotion with WB, and AEW you can see more regularly, but I don't know that AEW sees any of the Mexican wrestlers as some guy who will be in their mix for the top titles. I think they see them as a fun part of the show, but not a top part of the show. So it feels like it's two different strategies. I don't know that either of them are going to go all the way with a Mexican star unless someone just knocks them over and forces the issue.
Yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic to me in the sense of like AEW really should be better at pushing Mexican talent in the sense of like you mentioned, like Tony Khan likes typical lucha libre style, and when they bring those guys in, they basically let them do what they do in Mexico without really any directions to do otherwise. They're allowed to be themselves. They're allowed to do what got them over in the first place in a way that in a freedom that isn't allowed in WWE. Yet, like you said, AEW really, despite AEW having many top Mexican wrestlers signed to their roster, AEW really hasn't pushed any lucha talents in a significant way. Like no one to me in AEW has been pushed the way like Konosuke Takeshita has gotten a push in AEW. And Takeshita, like some of the lucha talent, is coming from another country. His English might not be that strong. Things that would typically be a limitation to getting a major push on American television. He is getting a pretty strong push, and I wonder, will AEW ever do that? Because they have the access to talent, and unlike WWE, they seem willing to let that talent be themselves, yet they haven't done that. WWE, on the flip side, seems to want to try to make a top Mexican star, but they're running into the issue of the fundamental problem that like they hate lucha libre. They want a Hispanic star, but they don't like anything to do with traditional lucha libre. They want to make a top Hispanic star to connect with the Hispanic market, but they also want someone who is good looking and tall and speaks good English and wrestles the style that they want to wrestle. And Lucha Libre is going to produce many, many diverse talents, but it's simply not going to produce a lot of tall, good looking, great English speaking guys that can wrestle WWE house style. But they want to mold someone into doing that. And that's why they were so infatuated with Del Rio for a long time, was because he did check those boxes.
Yeah, and I think eventually what WWE really wants is they want to find they're going to someday find their Mexican American star who can do the promos, and then they'll hopefully is athletic to do the wrestling the style they want. But until then, I think
Dominic
they're
Mysterio,
going to
they've already
keep
found him.
trying to find. Yeah, they're going to keep on trying to find the next Rey Mysterio, because they feel like that's an archetype that could work again. But I don't think they're going to ever invest the resources and the push to get someone over like
So, Cubs fan, you're kind of cutting out right now on my end. I don't know if you want to leave and come back. That might be better. This is going to come across as terrible audio, but we're not editing it.
They probably see like a Dragon Lee, and obviously they've seen this storyline. It could be.
So Cubs fan left. He's going to come back. I apologize for that absolutely awful audio that will not be edited. We're leaving it in there. But to Cubs fans' point, like when he was talking about Rey Mysterio, and they're trying to always try to find the next Rey Mysterio, and they have signed a lot of guys over the years that were masked high flyers, and they've taken the mask off some of them. They took off Andrade, and they took it off Phantasma. But the idea is and it's kind of an annoying idea to me that they are trying to identify, like, every Mexican wrestler that they have kind of has to be pigeonholed into the masked superhero look, and it obviously worked for Rey Mysterio, but that is kind of an outdated character, and there are a lot different types of characters that Mexican American fans and regular American fans can gravitate towards beyond just the Rey Mysterio masked superhero type. Cubs fan is back now. Cubs fan, can you hear me okay? I cannot hear you if you were talking.
Oh, okay.
Okay, you're good now.
I'm not sure. I thought I was talking. Let me. Okay. Okay, where did we leave off? Or do you need me to start talking?
No, I mean, I was kind of pontificating on like the Rey Mysterio archetype as being something that they are chasing after. And kind of, I guess my point is that that's kind of an outdated archetype, like the masked superhero. And there's a lot more versatility. There's a lot different roles that Lucha Libre wrestlers could serve. And it's kind of a disservice to just sign another small, high flying guy with a mask and hope that he turns into the next Rey Mysterio, because the next Rey Mysterio isn't coming. They've been trying to replace him for almost 20 years now.
Yeah, and the next room, it's tough to be the next Rey Mysterio when the original Rey Mysterio is still there. I mean, that was the problem with the second Mystico. He was a good wrestler, Drilistico, but everyone knew the real Mystico was out there, and eventually he came back. And there was no way the second generation one was ever going to surpass the first one. And he could be 5 times as better, but he does not have the history or the memory of the original one. It would be best for for WB to go to a different role. And I think ultimately they would be happier if they found someone who is a more traditional wrestler who happened to be Mexican American that they could portray as a Mexican star. I wonder, like, had Seth Rollins come along 10 years later, if they would have played that part of his character up more, or that part of his background. But I think that's ultimately the kind of star that's going to fit their promotion better.
Is Seth Rollins Mexican American?
I thought he was. I thought Colby Lopez was
I
Mexican American, but
Yeah,
maybe
I
I'm
remember
confusing
hearing that he was
with somebody else.
yeah,
I
I
hope
remember
I hope I just did not offend someone else.
I remember hearing that he like I know his last name is Lopez, which is obviously Latino. But I remember reading that like he has that last name, but he's actually like Armenian or something. Like he's actually not Mexican American. Like the last name is like the last name of his stepdad or something like that. Um,
Yeah, Wikipedia is agreeing with you, so I apologize. It's not problems. Maybe I'm thinking of Paul London. Let's use Paul London as an example. Paul London more inches of height. That would work.
yeah, well, like obviously he's not Mexican American, but they did find, I think, something where they signed Damian Priest, who is tall and speaks good English and Latino, and wrestles the way they want someone to wrestle. I always thought it was interesting that they didn't give him, they gave him like an Anglo-Saxon name instead of giving him a Latin name. I personally would have kept his name as Punishment Martinez because I thought that was an awesome name. But that is someone that they're trying to like push into that role, kind of. And obviously, he's the Money in the Bank holder, and he got at least the rub from working with Bad Bunny, which is a I know Bad Bunny is a from Puerto Rico and is maybe a different culture than Mexican American culture, but is at least a Spanish speaking star. And but he's also like I think over 40 years old at this point. So I don't know where that next person that they're gonna find from Mexico is gonna be. I have a hard time it's gonna be like Dragon Lee getting the rocket strapped to the moon.
No, I think he's so what doesn't fit their style that they're going to eventually have trouble accepting working him in. Um, yeah, I think they're just gonna have to. I think maybe the long-term future is that they get lucky with an NIL person that they're bringing in, and that they fits their profile that they're looking for. Because I don't see them finding the right guy in Mexico that they want to bring in. There's not even like an obvious candidate in CMLL or AAA that would immediately fit what they're looking for either. So I think it's probably going to come from a different direction.
Yeah, that would require their performance center to actually produce some top talent too. If it's going to be someone from one of the a college football lineman or someone that they train to wrestle. I kind of thought that and he was in Lucha Underground, but I always kind of thought that Tejano was like an interesting potential American TV wrestler. I know I never really worked out that end, and he's probably too old at this point. But when I first saw him, I was like, this is a guy I could see getting a push on American TV.
Yeah, I think he would have. He was not a guy who I felt like got some of the guys got chances in Impact and other promotions, and for whatever reason it did not work out for Tejano. But he works a style that's more fitting with the U.S. wrestling style. I know his English was not very good at that point, and he's since worked on it. But I think that there's probably that's probably maybe more of a model of someone who could work in the U.S. as it in the way that the U.S. A WWE promotion would want to a Mexican wrestler to work.
Mhm. I wanted to ask you like a broader question about Lucha Libre in the US, in that if you go back and read a lot of stuff from like 20 years ago, everyone's hot take at like the turn of the millennium for wrestling is that Lucha Libre is going to become huge in the United States. And they all use the logic that, the Hispanic demographic is the fastest growing demographic in the United States. There are more and more, Hispanic speaking households in the United States every day. And there, Mexican wrestling is a huge industry in Mexico, and that's underserved in the United States. And that like Lucha Libre is like the next big thing in the US. And over the past 20 years, that really hasn't been the case. And, amongst hardcore wrestling fans, that have emerged, talking on forums and things like that, it seems like Puro Japanese wrestling is much more popular than Lucha Libre. And like, I'm curious to know, as someone who has kind of taken on that mantle as being a voice of Lucha Libre, in the online wrestling fandom, why do you think that Lucha Libre hasn't taken off in the United States, whether it's Lucha promotions in the US or the major US promotions using more Lucha talent and presenting a more Lucha based product? Why do you think that, like, over the last 20 years, Lucha Libre never took off the way that so many people seem to think it was going to?
I think to some extent, the Lucha Libre, the concept has taken off. I think the Mexican style of wrestling is more popular in the U.S. than the Japanese style of wrestling as a general concept. Like you'll see TV shows reference Lucha Libre. The Cassandra movie, I just had their trailer today. There's cartoons and other stuff where the general concept of Lucha Libre is popular, but I don't think the brands itself are as popular in the US. I think um, there's not a strong affinity for AAA. There's not a strong affinity for CMLL, even compared to like a New Japan speak, or especially compared to US promotion. I think that the promotions themselves have had a hard time consistently exporting themselves to the US, where um, they're they don't have much English language content. They're not as accessible at times for outside fans. Even though for a long time both promotions were like doing their big shows on YouTube, it just felt like there was a learning curve that was bigger there because there weren't U.S. stars that fans knew coming over. Like they come over to New Japan or Noah, where those are an entry point for those kind of fans to get in. Um, and I think that the promotions like CML does not care about as much about expanding to the US as maybe a Japanese promotion does. And I think they were at AAA when they've done it hit or miss, and they've had like stabs at doing stuff and then disappearing for months in a way where it makes it hard for people to build up interest for them. I think you can look at there have been some successes. Obviously, like I think Lucha Underground was probably as popular or around as popular as maybe a little less than what New Japan was doing on Access for a while. And if you could present the commonality of those is that they were both presentations of that style of wrestling in an English language format in a way a little closer, maybe not exactly how Lucha Libre was presented in Mexico, but enough of that and enough of what U.S. fans expected to see. In the same way that New Japan made their shows a little bit easier to follow, especially those early access shows when they had the interviews with the wrestlers to get so people identified with the more. And I don't think that work has been done consistently on a Lucha Libre platform, even when they had TV on basic cable or when it was on Galavision in the US. It was stuff that if you knew these guys, you understood why they were fighting and what they were about, but they are not as good as selling the ideas for everyone. And I think the other thing is that Japanese wrestling, especially 90s, OOs, 10s, it was more worked more on the structure comparable to US wrestling, where there was always a few months, there was a tour building to a big show, and then another tour building to another big show that were in a way close to the US pay-per-view model, where Lucha Libre would just have TV shows, and then sometimes they would build the big events, but sometimes they just run TV and TV and TV for months. They're just regular shows where you don't have the big matches or the big cycle that people are used to that provide the big jumping in points where everyone's really excited about a Wrestle Kingdom, but they may not get the same feeling about they may not have the same excitement about a Triple Mania because the Triple Mania matches just came about in the few weeks before, and the Wrestle Kingdom since the G1 was building towards this big moment. I think it's somewhat a presentation. It's somewhat a branding issue of getting those brands over in the US, and I think it's somewhat just an exposure of not having that English language exposure that help people get used to watching the show who aren't really fans already.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to me is like when we talk about like demographics and like I'm sure like 20 years ago people are looking at US demographics and they're seeing, oh, Hispanic households, Mexican American households are on the rise. That's gonna be the next big thing. But as we've seen over the last 20 years, not just in wrestling, but kind of across culture in general, like Spanish speaking television is very popular in the United States, but seems to have almost no footprint outside of the Spanish speaking community. Um, Liga MX, does very well television ratings in the US, but when you were to turn it on to like um, I don't know, like if you looked at the TV ratings for network television, like sometimes SmackDown will get beaten by whatever is on Univision. Like it's not necessarily wrestling, but it's always, very competitive with what's on NBC and Fox and ABC. And that makes a broader point in the sense that that culture is kind of isolated in a certain vacuum of like our general pop culture, and it doesn't cross over to the same rate that other things do. And I think wrestling is unfortunately a negative um, consequence of that, and that's probably prevented Lucha Libre from growing. I do think you make a really good point about like the style of wrestling is more prevalent in the United States than maybe like luchadors themselves. Like if you watch any wrestling promotion right now in the US, WWE, AEW, any indie, um, you'll see guys doing lucha libre moves. You'll see guys doing hurricane ranas and things like that. And that is all, consequences of lucha libre influence on American wrestling. Cubsfan is now gone. I believe his technical difficulties have probably shut down his service. But that's fine because we're going to wrap this episode anyway. I want to thank him for coming on to the show. I want to thank all the listeners who have been out there listening to these shows. I apologize for the technical difficulties that we had, but hopefully you still enjoyed the episode, and I think we had a really good discussion. So appreciate everyone who's been listening, and obviously thanks to Cubsfan. I want to say, yeah, you can follow him on Luchablog, on social media, and you can check out his website, which again is, thecubsfan.com, where he does, pretty much daily updates on pretty much everything you want to know. So if you liked what you heard and you want to learn more about Lucha Libre, it's definitely the place to check it out. Appreciate everyone, and I will see everyone again in the future.